They found Caleb Ward's horse before sunrise, standing alone at the edge of the tree line, reins dragging in the dust, saddle still warm like its rider had only just stepped away. But there was no rider, no tracks leading back to town, only a faint smear along the leather that caught the light wrong and made men shift their weight without saying a word. Because out here a horse doesn't come home without its man unless something has gone quiet in a way that doesn't sit right in the bones. And that morning the wind didn't move, the birds didn't call, and even the old boards of the saloon held their creak like they were listening for something that wasn't coming back. Now before we go further, just think on this. Where are you watching from? What place do you call home when the road runs out? Because stories like this don't belong to one town. They ride farther than fences, and this one started the night before, when the girl first appeared. Not from the road like any traveler with sense, but from the dark between the trees where no lantern reaches and no trail dares to stay straight. She stepped into the edge of town without a sound, barefoot despite the cold, her dress marked with dust and distance, her hair catching the last of the firelight like it carried its own shadow, and nobody noticed her at first, not until she stopped in front of Caleb Ward's place and stood there like she had been there before, like she knew the shape of the door without ever knocking on it. Caleb was inside, sitting at a rough-cut table with a tin cup gone cold in his hand, a man who kept to himself the way some men keep to prayer, quiet, deliberate, carrying something behind the eyes that didn't ask to be seen. He heard the step before the knock that never came, just the shift of weight on old wood, and when he opened the door, she didn't speak right away. She just looked at him, not like a stranger measuring danger, but like someone recognizing something already decided, and that was the first thing that felt wrong, because men out here are used to being looked at with caution or need, not certainty, not by someone who seemed to be waiting for them before. They even knew they were part of anything. She said his name without asking, just Caleb, quiet, steady, like it belonged to her as much as it did to him. And he didn't answer right away because something in his chest tightened the way it does when memory brushes past without stopping long enough to explain itself. He asked what she wanted, simple, flat, the way you do when you don't want to invite more than what's already standing in front of you. She didn't answer that either, not directly. She just said, "You shouldn't follow me." And for a moment it almost sounded like a kindness, like a warning given to someone who hadn't yet made a mistake. Then she turned, just like that, stepping back into the dark where the trees stood too close together. And that should have been the end of it, a strange moment swallowed by the night. But Caleb didn't close the door, didn't call after her, didn't reach for his rifle. He just stood there watching the space she left behind, and something older than reason moved in him, something quieter than fear. And when he stepped out onto the porch, the boards didn't creak this time, like they were letting him go without protest. He saddled up without hurry, hands steady, movements practiced, but his eyes stayed on that line where the trees began, like he already knew there wouldn't be any turning back once he crossed it. And when he rode out, the town didn't notice, not yet. Just one man heading toward the forest like men sometimes do when they've run out of reasons to stay. But the forest noticed, it always does, and somewhere past the first line of shadow, where the air turns cooler and the ground stops telling you where others have been, Caleb Ward followed a girl who told him not to, and by the time the sun came up, the only thing that returned was his horse, and even that didn't look like it understood why. By mid-morning the whole town had heard about the horse, not because anyone announced it, but because silence travels faster than words in a place that small. Men gathered without calling it a meeting, hats low, eyes on the animal tied outside the post, its sides still rising slow and steady, its coat damp along the neck as if it had been ridden hard, and then stopped all at once without understanding why. Sheriff Doyle was the first to step close enough to touch the saddle, his fingers brushing the leather like he expected it to speak back. "Still warm," he said, though no one had asked, and that was enough to set something loose in the air, because warmth meant recent, and recent meant close, and close meant whatever had happened was not finished yet. Someone mentioned the forest without saying the word fully, just out there, like naming it might make it listen. And another man spat into the dirt, saying nobody goes in past the first mile unless they are looking to lose something they cannot get back. But old Miriam from the boarding house spoke up from the porch where she always sat with her blanket and her knowing eyes. She said she saw a girl the night before, standing where the lamplight fades, Said the girl did not move like someone passing through. Said she stood like she was waiting for a door to open. And when she said that, 3 men looked at each other without liking what they were thinking, because they had seen that kind of stillness before, not often, but enough to remember it does not belong to ordinary trouble. Sheriff Doyle asked what the girl looked like, and Miriam did not answer right away. She took her time, watching the horse instead, then said, like she knew something we did not. And that did not help. Not one bit. By noon a search was decided without calling it one. Just men saddling up, checking their rifles without making a show of it, speaking in low voices about trails and creek beds, and how far a man could go before the ground stopped telling his story. They rode out in a loose line, not too close together, each man wanting enough space to turn if he had to. The forest stood ahead of them the same way it always did, tall, patient, not inviting, not warning, just there. And that was the part that unsettled most of them, because danger you can see has edges, but this had none. They found the first sign just past the broken fence where the grass grows uneven, a single hoof mark deeper than the rest, like the horse had paused, maybe resisted, maybe listened, and then nothing, no second track, no turn, just a place where the earth decided to keep its secrets. One of the younger men said maybe the ground was too hard, maybe the wind had taken it, but nobody agreed out loud. They kept moving, slower now, eyes on the spaces between trees, on the shadows that did not shift with the light. A mile in, the air changed, cooler by a few degrees, quiet in a way that made their own breathing sound too loud. Sheriff Doyle raised a hand and they stopped without question, because even the ones who did not believe in stories knew when something fell off. And right there, nailed to the side of a tree at shoulder height, was a strip of cloth, clean, tied with a knot none of them recognized. It was not torn, not caught. It was placed, deliberate, and the color was one Doyle knew well, part of a bandana Caleb always kept tucked at his collar. The sheriff reached out, but did not touch it. Not yet, like he was waiting for it to explain itself. That is his, someone said behind him, and Doyle nodded once, slow, because it was, but the knot was wrong. The placement was wrong. Everything about it said this was not a thing left behind by accident. This was something meant to be found, and that made it worse, because it meant someone wanted them to come this far, and maybe no farther. Doyle finally pulled the cloth free, turned it in his hand, then looked deeper into the trees where the light thinned out into something gray and uncertain. He could feel the men behind him shifting, not in fear exactly, but in that careful way men move when they realize the rules they know might not apply. We go a little further, he said, though his voice had lost some of its weight, and they did, step by step, until the forest closed in tighter, until the space between trunks narrowed, and the ground softened underfoot like it had not been walked in years. And then, just as suddenly as the sign had appeared, it stopped. No more cloth, no more marks, no sound but the wind high above where it could not reach them. Doyle stood there longer than he needed to, staring into a place that did not give anything back. Then he did something that told the others more than any words could have. He turned around, slow and certain, and said, "We head back." And nobody argued, not one of them, because out here, sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is know when he has been told, without a voice, that the rest of the story does not belong to him. The town did not speak Caleb Ward's name that evening, not because they had forgotten him, but because saying it out loud felt like calling something back that had already chosen not to return. The saloon stayed quieter than usual, glasses set down softer, chairs scraping less against the floor. Even the piano man played with one hand and left the other resting like he was waiting for a note that never came. Sheriff Doyle sat near the window where he could see the edge of the street fading into open land, the forest beyond that line darker now, heavier somehow, as if it had taken something in and grown around it. And across from him sat Miriam, her blanket folded neatly over her lap, her eyes fixed not on Doyle but on the space between his words. "You went in," she said finally, not a question, and Doyle nodded once, slow, then placed the folded cloth on the table between them, the knot still holding its shape like it had memory in it. Miriam leaned forward, her fingers hovering just above it without touching. Then she let out a breath that sounded older than her years. "That is not a man's knot," she said, and Doyle frowned slightly, not because he disagreed, but because he had no better answer. "Then whose is it?" he asked, and Miriam looked past him, toward the door, toward the place where the night pressed up against the glass. Someone who does not leave things by accident, she said, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The kind of silence that settles when both people understand something without wanting to say it out loud. Outside, the horse shifted its weight, the soft thud of hoof against dirt carrying further than it should have, and Doyle glanced out, watching the animal lower its head like it was listening for a voice it knew. Later that night, when most lights had gone out and the town had folded in on itself, Doyle found himself walking back toward the edge of the street, not with purpose, not with a plan, just with that quiet pull that comes when a man feels something unfinished pressing against his ribs. He stopped where the dust gave way to grass, where Caleb had ridden out without looking back, and he stood there long enough for the night to settle around him, the kind of stillness that makes a man aware of his own breathing. And then he heard it, not loud, not clear, just a faint shift somewhere beyond the first line of trees, like a step placed carefully, not to be hidden, but not to be found either. Doyle did not reach for his gun, did not call out. He just stood there, listening. And for a moment he thought he saw movement between the trunks, something pale catching what little moonlight filtered through, but when he narrowed his eyes it was gone, or maybe it had never been there. And that was the part that unsettled him most, not knowing if he had seen something real or just wanted to. The next morning brought more questions than answers. Men gathered again, this time not to search, but to decide what to believe. Some said Caleb had gotten lost, that the forest could twist a man around until he forgot which way was home. Others said the girl had led him somewhere he should not have gone, their voices carrying that edge of accusation that comes easy when something cannot be explained. But Miriam did not join them. She stayed on her porch, watching, waiting, until finally she spoke loud enough for those nearest to hear. He was told not to follow, she said, and the words settled over the group like dust, simple, undeniable. One of the younger men laughed nervously, said no man worth anything turns away from a mystery, and Miriam's eyes shifted to him, steady, unblinking. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, she replied, and that quieted him more than any threat could have. Sheriff Doyle said nothing, but he felt it, that line they had crossed and then stepped back from, that sense that the forest had drawn a boundary not with fences or warnings, but with absence. And somewhere deep in that silence was a choice, not forced, not taken, but made, and the more he thought on it, the more the pieces did not sit like loss, but like intention, like a door closed from the inside rather than shut from without. And that thought stayed with him longer than it should have, because it meant Caleb Ward had not simply disappeared, he had stepped into something and chosen not to step back. And out here, that kind of choice carries a weight no man can explain to another. Only feel when the wind goes still and the trees stop giving anything back. 3 days passed, and the town settled into a quiet that did not feel like peace, but something heavier, something waiting, the kind of stillness that presses on a man's chest when he is trying not to think about what he already knows. Sheriff Doyle stopped asking questions out loud, but he did not stop listening. Every sound carried further now. Every small thing felt like it meant more than it should, and on the fourth morning, just as the sun began to stretch long across the open land, a rider appeared on the horizon, not fast, not slow, just steady, like he had been traveling a long way without needing to hurry. The man rode alone, his horse moving with that quiet certainty that comes from knowing exactly where it is going. And when he reached the edge of town, he did not call out, did not announce himself. He simply dismounted and walked forward, his boots barely stirring the dust. The few people who saw him first did not speak, because there was something about the way he carried himself that asked for silence instead of attention. His hair was long, streaked with gray, tied back with a strip of leather that had seen years of sun and weather. His clothing was simple but worn with purpose, nothing unnecessary, nothing decorative. And when his eyes moved across the buildings, they did not linger, they measured, like he was looking for something specific and nothing else mattered. Sheriff Doyle stepped out from the shade of the post office and met him halfway, the two men, standing about 10 feet apart, close enough to speak without raising their voices, far enough to show respect. The stranger reached into his coat slowly, not in a way that threatened, but in a way that made Doyle pay attention, and he pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth, holding it in both hands before extending it forward, not offering it, not forcing it, just presenting it like something that had weight beyond its size. Doyle hesitated for half a second before taking it. The fabric felt familiar even before he unfolded it, and when he did, his breath caught just enough to show it mattered. Inside was another piece of Caleb's bandana, cleaner than the first, but tied with the same careful knot. Only this one held something. Within it, a small, smooth stone wrapped tight at the center, its surface marked with faint lines that curved and crossed in patterns that did not belong to any map Doyle had ever seen. He looked up, meeting the stranger's eyes, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because some exchanges do not need words to be understood. "Where did you get this?" Doyle asked finally, his voice steady but quieter than before. The man did not answer right away. He let the question sit between them, then said, "Where it was meant to be found." His English was clear but carried a rhythm that did not come from the town or any place near it. Doyle studied him, searching for something that would explain more than the words had. "Is he alive?" he asked, and this time the pause lasted longer. The stranger's gaze shifted slightly, not away, but past Doyle, toward the line of trees in the distance. And when he spoke again his voice was softer, almost respectful. "He is not lost," he said, and that answer did not settle anything. It only moved the question into a place Doyle could not reach. "That is not what I asked," Doyle replied, and the stranger's eyes returned to him, calm, untroubled. "It is the only answer you need," he said, and for a moment Doyle felt something tighten in his chest, not anger, not fear, but the weight of standing at the edge of something that would not open just because he asked. The stranger nodded once, a gesture of completion more than farewell, then turned, walking back to his horse without another word. He mounted in one smooth motion and rode out the same way he had come, steady, unhurried, as if time moved differently for him. Doyle stood there holding the cloth and the stone, feeling the shape of that knot pressing into his palm, and behind him the town watched without speaking, because they all understood something had just passed through their hands that did not belong to them. Miriam stepped closer at last, her eyes fixed on the stone. "He crossed," she said quietly, and Doyle glanced at her. "Crossed what?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would not be simple. Miriam shook her head slightly, not in refusal, but in acceptance. "Not a place you can point to," she said. "A line you only see once you are on the other side." Doyle closed his hand around the cloth, the weight of it settling deeper than it should have, and for the first time since the horse had come back alone, he stopped thinking about what had happened to Caleb Ward, and started understanding what Caleb Ward had chosen. The stone did not leave Sheriff Doyle's hand that day, not while the sun climbed, not while it fell, and not even when the town settled into another uneasy night. He carried it like a question that refused to be asked out loud, turning it slowly between his fingers, tracing the faint lines carved into its surface as if they might shift under his touch and reveal something more if he just held it long enough. But they did not change. They stayed exactly as they were, quiet, certain, and unmoved by his need to understand. By evening he found himself sitting on the steps outside his office, the same place he had watched men come and go for years, but now the road looked different, longer somehow, like it led somewhere he had never considered before. Miriam joined him without invitation, settling down beside him with the same ease she carried into everything, her presence not loud but never unnoticed. She looked at the stone once, then back at the road. "You are trying to make it speak. Your language," she said, and Doyle let out a slow breath. "And it is not," he replied, not frustrated, just tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Miriam nodded. "Some things are not meant to explain themselves to us," she said. "They are meant to be accepted." Doyle turned the stone over once more, the edges smooth, worn by time or by hands that understood it better than he did. "He could have come back," Doyle said after a while, not as an argument, not even as a statement, just a thought that would not sit still. Miriam did not answer right away. She let the silence stretch, then said, "Or he could have stayed where he was needed," and that settled between them heavier than anything else had, because it was not about what had happened anymore. It was about why. The next morning Doyle did something he had already decided the night before, though he had not admitted it even to himself. He saddled his horse before sunrise, before anyone else could see him go, not because he was hiding, But because this was not something he wanted turned into a spectacle, he rode out alone, following the same path they had taken days earlier, past the broken fence, past the place where the hoof mark had sunk deeper into the earth, and into the forest that seemed to hold its breath as he entered. The air cooled the same way. The sounds faded the same way, and when he reached the tree, where the cloth had been tied, he stopped, dismounted, and stood there for a long moment. The place felt unchanged, as if time had decided not to move forward in that spot. Doyle took the stone from his pocket, still wrapped in the cloth, and held it in his palm, feeling its weight settle into something steadier than doubt. He looked ahead, deeper into the trees where the light grew thin, where the ground stopped offering any sign of what had passed before. And for a moment, just a moment, he considered going further, stepping beyond the point where they had turned back, crossing whatever line had been drawn without words. But the thought did not carry urgency. It did not push him forward. It simply stood there, waiting to be accepted or released. Doyle closed his hand around the stone, then did something that surprised even him. He stepped forward one pace, just one, enough to feel the difference in the ground beneath his boots. Softer, quieter, like it had not been disturbed in a long time. And in that single step he understood something he had been circling since the beginning, that whatever lay beyond was not hidden by force. It was protected by choice, and that choice did not belong to him. He exhaled, slowly, then stepped back, returning to the place he knew, the place that still answered when a man asked where he stood. Doyle bent down and placed the stone at the base of the tree, not throwing it, not leaving it carelessly, but setting it there with intention, the cloth still wrapped tight around it, the knot facing outward, visible, like a sign that did not need to be read to be understood. He straightened, took one last look into the forest, and for the first time since Caleb had ridden out, he did not feel the need to follow. The weight in his chest eased, not gone, but settled into something quieter, something that did not demand answers. As he mounted his horse and turned back toward town, the forest did not change. It did not acknowledge him, but it no longer felt like something he needed to solve, and that was the difference. Back in town, no one asked him what he had found, not because they did not care, but because they could see it in the way he moved, in the way his eyes no longer searched the horizon for something missing. Miriam watched him from her porch, her gaze steady as ever, and when their eyes met, she gave a small nod, not approval, not agreement, just recognition, and Doyle returned it, because some stories do not end with answers, they end with understanding, and out here, that is often the closest thing to truth a man ever gets. The town did not change overnight, not in the way people like to believe stories end. There was no sudden lightness, no clear answer passed from one man to the next, but something subtle shifted in the days that followed, like a knot pulled just enough to loosen the tension without coming undone. Sheriff Doyle went back to his routine, checking fences, settling small disputes, watching the road like he always had. But there was a difference in how he stood, less like a man waiting for something to return, and more like a man who had accepted that not everything comes back the same way it leaves. The horse was no longer tied outside the post. It had been led back to Caleb's place, fed, brushed, cared for by hands that did not belong to its rider, and yet the animal seemed calmer now, as if whatever had unsettled it before had been resolved in a way the town could not see. Miriam continued her quiet watch from the porch, but her eyes no longer searched the edge of the forest with the same weight. She watched people instead, the way they moved, the way they spoke, noticing how the story had settled differently in each of them. Some held onto the idea of loss, speaking Caleb's name with a kind of quiet mourning. Others turned it into a warning, a story told low over drinks about where not to go and what not to follow. But a few, just a few, carried it differently, not as something taken, but as something chosen, and those were the ones Miriam watched most closely, because they understood without needing to explain. One afternoon, as the sun leaned west and the shadows stretched long across the street, a small group of riders appeared in the distance, not hurried, not hidden, just present in a way that did not ask permission. There were 3 of them this time, spaced evenly, their horses moving in quiet rhythm, and when they reached the edge of town they did not stop, did not dismount. They simply slowed, their eyes moving across the buildings, the people, the spaces between, as if taking note of something unseen. Sheriff Doyle stepped forward again, not with tension, not with challenge, just with the same measured calm he had carried before. One of the riders, younger than the first man who had come days earlier, leaned slightly in his saddle and placed something on the ground without stepping off his horse, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, similar to the one Doyle had held before, but this one lighter, smaller, and when they moved on, continuing through the town without looking back, Doyle did not call after them. He waited until they had passed, until the sound of their horses faded into the distance. Then he bent down and picked up the bundle. The cloth was tied in a simpler knot, easier to open, and inside he found a single item, a thin strip of leather, worn smooth, with a small piece of metal attached, the kind used to fasten a saddle strap. Something ordinary, something that would mean nothing to anyone else, but Doyle recognized it immediately. It was Caleb's, a piece from his gear that had been missing for as long as anyone could remember. And for a moment Doyle just stood there holding it, the weight of something simple carrying more meaning than it should have. Miriam stepped closer again, her presence as steady as ever, and she looked at the object without touching it. "He is letting go," she said quietly, and Doyle glanced at her. "Of what?" he asked, though part of him already understood. Miriam's eyes stayed on the leather. "Of the man he was there," she said then, lifted her gaze toward the forest beyond the town. "And becoming who he is there." Doyle closed his hand around the strap, the familiar shape fitting into his palm like it always had, but it did not feel like a loss. Not anymore. It felt like a message, not written in words, but in pieces left behind, each one a step further from the life Caleb had known, each one a sign not of absence, but of transformation. And as the sun dipped lower, casting the town in that soft, fading light that makes everything look both clearer and more distant at the same time, Doyle understood something he had not allowed himself to see before, that this was not a story about a man who vanished into the forest. It was a story about a man who walked into something greater than himself and chose to stay, not out of fear, not out of force, but out of understanding. And out here, where the land teaches its lessons slowly and without mercy, that kind of choice carries a truth that does not need to be spoken, only respected. The days stretched into weeks, and the story did not grow louder. It grew quieter, settling into the town like dust that no one bothered to sweep away because it no longer felt like something that needed to be removed. Sheriff Doyle kept the leather strap in his pocket, not as evidence, not as proof, but as something that reminded him there were answers that did not come in words. He would take it out sometimes when the sun sat low and the shadows ran long across the street, turning it between his fingers the same way he had once turned the stone. But now there was no tension in the motion, no searching, just recognition. Miriam noticed that, of course she did. She noticed everything that mattered and most things that did not. And one evening she joined him again without a word, settling into her usual place beside him as if time had not moved at all. "They will stop coming soon," she said, her voice soft but certain. Doyle glanced at her. "The riders," she added before he could ask, and he nodded slowly, not surprised. "Because there is nothing left to return," he said. And Miriam gave a small shake of her head. "No," she replied, "because there is nothing left to explain." And that difference settled deeper than anything else she had said, because it meant the story had reached its end not when the town understood it, but when it no longer needed to. A few days later, just before dawn, when the world sits in that quiet space between night and morning, Doyle found himself awake without knowing why. The air felt different, not heavy, not still, but aware, like something had shifted just enough to be noticed if a man was paying attention. He stepped outside, the sky barely touched with light, and walked toward the edge of town without thinking about it. The ground cool beneath his boots, the world holding that kind of silence that feels full instead of empty. And there, just beyond the first line where grass gives way to shadow, he saw movement, not sudden, not hidden, just present, a figure standing between the trees, still, composed, and for a moment Doyle did not move, did not call out. He simply watched, because something in him understood that this was not a moment to interrupt. The figure stepped forward just enough for the light to catch it, and Doyle felt his breath slow without realizing it. The posture, the way the shoulders carried weight without tension, the way the head tilted slightly, as if listening to something beyond the town. It was familiar, Not in the way of seeing a man every day, but in the way of recognizing something you had already accepted. Caleb Ward stood there, not close enough to step into the street, not far enough to disappear completely, dressed differently now, his clothing simpler, shaped by a life that did not match the one he had left behind, his hair tied back, his face calm, not hardened, not softened, just settled, and for a long moment. Neither man spoke, because words would have made it smaller than it was. Doyle did not ask why he had not returned, did not ask what he had found, because the answers were already there in the way Caleb stood, in the way he did not step forward, and in the way he did not need to. Caleb's eyes met Doyle's for a brief moment, steady, clear, and there was something in that look that carried more weight than any explanation could have. Not apology, not regret, but acknowledgement, the kind given between men who understand a choice without needing it justified. Caleb gave a single nod, small, deliberate, then turned, not away in haste, not in secrecy, but with the same quiet certainty that had carried him into the forest in the first place. And he walked back into the trees, not vanishing, not fading, simply becoming part of something that did not belong to the town anymore. Doyle stood there long after the figure was gone, the morning light slowly filling the space where shadow had been, and when he finally turned back, there was no urgency in his step, no need to tell anyone what he had seen, because this was not something meant to be shared in words, it was something meant to be held in silence. And as the town woke behind him, as doors opened and voices returned and life moved forward the way it always does, Doyle carried that moment with him not as a secret, but as a truth, one that did not ask to be believed, only respected, because out here, sometimes a man does not disappear, sometimes he simply walks far enough to become who he was always meant to be, and the rest of the world learns to let him stay there. The morning after carried no sign of what Sheriff Doyle had seen, and that was the way it was meant to be. The town woke as it always did, with the creak of doors, the low murmur of voices, the slow rhythm of people returning to work that did not wait for stories to finish. And yet something had settled deeper beneath it all, not spoken, not pointed at, but present in the way people no longer looked toward the forest expecting anything to come out of it. The edge of the trees became just that. Again, an edge, not a question, not a threat, just a line where one world ended and another began. And for the first time since Caleb had ridden out, the town did not feel like it was missing something. It felt like it had been given something it could not quite name. Sheriff Doyle did not speak of what he saw, not to Miriam, not to the men who still gathered at the saloon, not even to himself in the quiet moments when memory has a way of replaying what matters most, because he understood now that putting it into words would make it smaller than it deserved to be. Instead, he carried it the same way he carried the leather strap, not as a burden, but as a reminder, and Miriam, who needed fewer words than most, watched him with that same steady gaze, seeing the difference without needing it explained. One evening as the sun dipped low and painted the town in that soft gold that makes everything look both older and more honest, she spoke again, not to ask, not to confirm, but simply to place something where it belonged. You saw him, she said, and Doyle did not look at her right away. He kept his eyes on the horizon, on that line where the light fades into shadow, then gave a small nod. Yes, he said, and that was enough. Miriam did not ask anything more, because she did not need to. The truth was already where it should be, not in words, but in understanding, and from that day on, the story changed, not in its details, not in its events, but in the way it was carried, no longer a tale of something lost, but something chosen. The younger men stopped speaking of the forest with the same edge in their voices, no longer daring each other to go further than they should, no longer turning it into something to prove themselves against. Instead, there was a quiet respect, an unspoken agreement that some places are not meant to be challenged, but acknowledged, and the older ones, those who had lived long enough to know that not everything needs to be explained, began to tell it differently, not as a warning, but as a reminder that a man's path is not always meant to circle back to where it began, that sometimes it leads somewhere that cannot be shared, only lived. And in the weeks that followed, no more riders came, no more objects were left behind. The exchange was complete, not because everything had been said, but because nothing more needed to be. The forest stood as it always had, quiet, patient, unchanged, and yet it felt different to those who had learned to see it not as something to enter, but something to respect. Sheriff Doyle continued his work, the same as before, but there was a steadiness in him, now that had not been there, a sense that he no longer needed to solve every silence, that some answers exist simply in the act of letting them be, and sometimes, late in the evening when the wind settled and the world grew still in that way that makes a man aware of his own place in it, he would stand at the edge of town, not searching, not waiting, just standing, knowing that somewhere beyond that line, beyond what could be seen or followed, a man he once knew was living a life that did not belong to this place anymore. And that was not something to question, not something to pull back, but something to accept with the same quiet dignity it had been chosen with. Because out here, the land does not take men without reason, and it does not give them back without meaning. And sometimes, the truest ending a story can have is not a return, but a departure that never needed to be explained. Winter came slow that year, not with a sudden drop in temperature or a hard line of frost, but with a quiet settling of cold into the bones of the land, the kind that seeps into wood and leather and lingers in the spaces between words. And the town adjusted the way it always did. Fires burned longer, doors stayed closed tighter, voices carried softer in the early hours. But there was something else beneath it all, something that did not belong to the season, something that had taken root in the way people looked at the world around them. Sheriff Doyle noticed it first in the smallest moments, in the way a man paused before stepping into the forest's edge to cut wood, not out of fear, but out of recognition, in the way a woman standing at the well would glance toward the tree line not with suspicion, but with a quiet respect, as if acknowledging a presence that did not need to be seen to be understood. Miriam said little as always, but one evening as snow threatened to fall, she spoke in that same steady voice that never rushed to be heard. "It is not about him anymore," she said, and Doyle, standing beside her with his hands resting on the railing, nodded before she finished. "No," he replied, "it is about what he showed us," and that was the truth of it. The story had moved beyond Caleb Ward, beyond the horse that returned alone, beyond the cloth and the stone and the quiet riders who came and went without asking permission. It had become something larger, something that lived in the space between what could be explained and what could only be accepted. The first snowfall came overnight, light but steady, covering the ground in a thin layer that softened every edge and quieted every sound. And in the morning the town stepped out into a world that looked both new and familiar, footprints marking paths that had been walked 100 times before. And for a moment, just a moment, Doyle found himself looking toward the forest again, not searching, not expecting, just acknowledging. The trees stood dusted and white, their outlines sharper against the pale sky. And for a brief second he thought of that morning weeks ago, of the figure standing just beyond the line, of the nod that needed no explanation, and he felt no pull to follow, no question rising in his chest, just a calm understanding that some paths are not meant to circle back, that some choices are not meant to be undone. Later that day, as the sun struggled to break through the gray, a single set of tracks appeared at the edge of town, not coming from the road, not leading away from it, but emerging from the direction of the forest, stopping just short of where the snow met the packed dirt of the street. Doyle saw them first, his eyes catching the shape. Before his mind placed it, he walked closer, each step measured, not out of caution, but out of respect for what he was looking at. The tracks were clear, one man's stride, steady, unhurried, the kind of walk that does not look back, and they ended there, not turning, not fading, just stopping as if the ground itself had decided that was far enough. Doyle stood over them, the cold air sharp in his lungs, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath again, not in tension, but in recognition. He did not step into the tracks, did not follow where they had come from. He simply stood there, letting the moment settle into him the way all the others had. And after a while, he turned and walked back, leaving them untouched, because some things are not meant to be disturbed, only witnessed. By afternoon the snow began again, light at first, then thicker, covering the tracks slowly, gently, until they were gone, not erased in a way that felt like loss, but in a way that felt complete, as if their purpose had been fulfilled the moment they were seen. And as evening fell and the town gathered close against the cold, Sheriff Doyle stood once more at the edge of the street, the forest quiet, the sky darkening above it, and he did not think of what had been taken or what had been left behind. He thought of a man who had stepped beyond a line most never see, and who had chosen, without force, without fear, to remain where he was needed. And in that choice, there was no mystery left to solve, no ending left to find, only a quiet truth that settled into the land the same way the snow did, covering nothing, hiding nothing, just resting there, waiting for those who knew how to see it. Because out here, justice does not always ride back into town. Sometimes it walks into the trees and stays there, where it belongs, without needing to be named.